My name is Demetrius Kowalski. I drove Chicago city buses for 18 years until Yellowstone erupted and turned my route into a frozen graveyard. When the Ice Age hit, I had one bus, 20 desperate passengers, and an impossible choice between saving strangers or finding my daughter in Milwaukee. 3 weeks taught me that in the apocalypse, you cannot save everyone, but you better save someone. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Demetrius Kowalski, but everyone on Route 23 called me Demo. For 18 years. I drove that same route through Chicago, from West Madison all the way downtown to the financial district. Same stops, same passengers, same complaints about traffic and late buses. I thought I knew what stress looked like until October 15th, 2024, when everything I understood about the world ended in a single morning. You have to understand something about being a city bus driver. We see everything. The businessman who takes the 7:15 every Tuesday always sits in the third seat, always reads the Tribune. The college kid who hops on at State Street, earbuds in, backpack covered in band stickers. Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who rode my bus 3 times a week to her dialysis appointments at Northwestern Memorial. These people become part of your routine, part of your responsibility. My ex-wife Elena always said my need to take care of everyone would be the death of me. Turns out she was half right. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I was finishing my 9 o'clock run, heading back to the depot after dropping off the last of the morning commuters. Chicago was doing what Chicago does in October. That perfect fall weather where you can smell winter coming, but it still feels manageable. The leaves were turning, people were walking a little faster, bundling up in their first sweaters of the season. Normal. Everything was completely normal until 9:47 in the morning. That's when every phone on my bus started buzzing at once. I remember thinking it was some kind of emergency alert test. You know how they do those tests that make every phone in the city scream at the same time? But this was different. The passengers weren't annoyed or rolling their eyes. They were reading their screens with this look I'd never seen before. Pure confusion mixed with something that might have been terror. Tommy Rodriguez, this college kid who rode my route every Tuesday and Thursday, he was sitting in his usual spot near the back. Good kid, always polite, studying something with computers at UIC. He looked up from his phone and said, "Mr. Demo, you hearing about this Yellowstone thing?" His voice had this shake to it that made my stomach drop. I pulled over at the next stop and grabbed my own phone. The emergency alert was simple and terrifying. Massive volcanic eruption at Yellowstone National Park. Immediate evacuation of surrounding areas. Ash cloud formation expected. Seek shelter and await further instructions. Now, I'd heard about Yellowstone being a supervolcano my whole life. One of those things you know intellectually but never really think about. Like how the sun will eventually burn out or how Lake Michigan used to be covered by glaciers. Abstract threats that belong in documentaries, not in your daily life as a Chicago bus driver. But here's what I remember most clearly about that moment. Mrs. Chen was sitting in her usual seat, 4th row on the right side. She always chattered about her appointments, her grandchildren in California, the weather. That morning she'd been unusually quiet, just staring out the window. When I looked at her after reading the alert, she was still staring outside, but now she was crying silently. She didn't say a word, just tears running down her cheeks like she understood something the rest of us hadn't figured out yet. I should have paid more attention to that. Mrs. Chen had lived through things most of us couldn't imagine. She'd seen what happens when the world changes overnight. I think she knew even then that this wasn't going to be the kind of emergency that gets fixed in a few days. The passengers started talking among themselves. That nervous chatter you get when nobody knows what's happening, but everyone knows. It's bad. Some were calling family members, others were Googling Yellowstone eruption on their phones. Tommy asked if I was going to finish the route or head back to the depot. Standard procedure would have been to return to base, check in with dispatch, follow whatever protocols the city had for this kind of situation. Instead, I made a decision that probably saved my life and definitely changed everything that came after. I decided to check on my regular passengers. See, most people don't understand what it means to drive the same route for 18 years. You don't just know the streets and the traffic patterns. You know the people. You know that Mr. Williams gets on at Ashland every Tuesday for his VA appointment. You know that the Patel family runs the corner store on Halsted and depends on the morning commuters for their breakfast rush. You know that Sarah Patel's kids take the school bus, but sometimes she rides with me when she's running errands downtown. These people weren't just faces to me. They were part of my daily responsibility, and something about that emergency alert, something about the way Mrs. Chen was crying told me that regular procedures weren't going to be enough. I announced to the remaining passengers that I was making some unscheduled stops to check on people. Most got off at the next regular stop, but Tommy stayed. He said he didn't have anywhere urgent to be, and besides, he was curious about what was really happening with this Yellowstone situation. I should have insisted he get off. I should have dropped him at his dorm and continued alone, but I was grateful for the company, and I think part of me already knew I was going to need help. Our first stop was Mrs. Chen's building in Chinatown. She lived in one of those old apartment buildings with narrow hallways and thin walls. The kind of place where you can hear everything your neighbors are doing. I'd dropped her off there hundreds of times, but I'd never actually been inside. She invited me up for tea once, but I was always too busy, always had to keep the schedule. When we knocked on her door, she answered immediately like she'd been waiting by the entrance. Her apartment was small but spotless, filled with photos of grandchildren and the smell of jasmine tea. She had the news on, some reporter standing in front of what looked like a massive cloud of ash stretching across the western sky. Mrs. Chen poured tea for Tommy and me without asking if we wanted any. Her hands were steady, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She told us about living through the Cultural Revolution in China, about times when the government would make announcements that changed everything overnight. When they tell you to seek shelter, she said, it means they don't know what else to tell you. We stayed for maybe 20 minutes watching the news coverage get more intense. Reports were coming in from Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. The eruption wasn't just big, it was unprecedented. Scientists were using words like catastrophic and global impact. The ash cloud was already affecting air traffic across the western United States. Then they started showing computer models of how the ash would spread, carried by wind patterns across the entire continent. Tommy asked the question we were all thinking. How long until it reaches Chicago? The meteorologist on screen was hedging, talking about variables and different scenarios, but his best estimate was 3 to 4 days for the initial ash cloud, with more significant effects developing over the following weeks. That's when Mrs. Chen said something that stuck with me. In China, we have a saying, when the mountain falls, the wise bird flies before the landslide. She was looking directly at me when she said it, but some birds stay to warn the others. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was just being philosophical, the way elderly people sometimes get when they're worried. But looking back, I think she was trying to tell me something about the choice I was going to have to make. The choice between saving myself and trying to save everyone else. We left Mrs. Chen with promises to check on her again soon. She had enough food for several days, she said, and her neighbor Mrs. Wu would look after her. But as we walked back to the bus, I kept thinking about how small and fragile she looked in that doorway, waving goodbye. Our next stop was Tommy's dorm at UIC. He wanted to check on his roommate and grab some supplies. The campus was buzzing. With activity, students clustered around phones and laptops getting updates from family members across the country. The ones from the western states looked shell-shocked. A girl from Montana was crying on the phone, trying to reach her parents. In Billings. Tommy's roommate wasn't there, but he'd left a note saying he was driving home to St. Louis to be with his family. Tommy packed a bag with clothes and his laptop, but I could tell he was thinking about his own family in Milwaukee. His parents, his younger sister who was still in high school. Milwaukee was only 90 miles north, an easy drive under normal circumstances. You should go, I told him. Take the train or rent a car. Get to your family while you still can. But Tommy shook his head. My dad's a firefighter, he's dealt with emergencies before. He'll know what to do. He paused, looking out his dorm window toward the city skyline. Besides, someone needs to help you check on people. You can't do all this alone. I should have insisted. I should have put him on the next train to Milwaukee. But I was grateful for the help, and I think I was already starting to understand that this was going to be bigger than just checking on a few passengers. By the time we left UIC, it was early afternoon. The news was getting worse by the hour. Airports across the western states were shutting down. Interstate highways were clogged with people trying to evacuate. The ash cloud was larger than anyone had initially predicted, and it was moving faster than the computer models had suggested. We spent the rest of the day visiting other regular passengers. Mr. Williams, the veteran who went to the VA hospital every Tuesday, was surprisingly calm. He'd been through emergencies before, he said, had supplies stored up, knew how to wait things out. But he was worried about other veterans he knew, older guys who lived alone without much family support. The Patel family was closing their store early, calling their relatives in other cities. Mr. Patel had lived through the partition of India as a child. He understood what it meant when the world changed overnight. He was already making plans to protect his family, stockpiling food and water, talking about whether they should leave Chicago or hunker down. Every stop we made, the picture became clearer. This wasn't going to be a temporary emergency. This was going to be something that changed everything, and most people didn't realize it yet. The city was still functioning normally. Traffic was moving, stores were open, people were going about their daily routines with just a little extra anxiety. But I was starting to see the cracks. The gas stations were busier than usual. The grocery stores had longer lines. People were making phone calls they'd been putting off, trying to reach family members they hadn't talked to in months. As we drove through the city that afternoon, I kept thinking about Mrs. Chen's words, about being the bird that stays to warn the others. I was starting to understand that my bus route wasn't just a job anymore. It was becoming something else entirely. By evening, when we finally headed back to the depot, Chicago looked the same as it always did. The skyline was still impressive. The traffic was still annoying. People were still walking their dogs and meeting friends for dinner. But there was something different in the air. A tension that hadn't been there that morning. At the depot, the other drivers were talking about the situation. Some were worried about their families in other states. Others were wondering if the city would suspend service, if this would affect their routes. Joe, our head mechanic, was the only one who seemed to understand the real implications. Joe had been working on city buses for 30 years. He'd seen every kind of weather, every kind of emergency. He was checking the depot's backup generator when I found him in the maintenance bay. "How long could that thing run?" I asked him. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at me seriously. "Full power for the whole facility? Maybe 3 weeks max. But if we're just talking about keeping the fuel pumps running and some basic lighting, maybe twice that." "What happens after that?" Joe shrugged, but his expression was grim. "After that, we're all in the dark." He paused, studying my face. "Why are you asking, Demo? You thinking about something?" I wasn't sure what I was thinking about, but I was looking at rows of buses, each with a full tank of diesel fuel. I was thinking about the depot's underground storage tanks, thousands of gallons of fuel that could keep a single bus running for months. I was thinking about the emergency kit I kept in my bus, the supplies I'd accumulated over the years that other drivers always teased me about. Most of all, I was thinking about Mrs. Chen crying silently as she stared out the window, like she could see something coming that the rest of us were too blind to notice. That night I went home to my empty apartment and tried to call Maya, my daughter. She was 19, a sophomore at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later. Still nothing. I turned on the news and watched the coverage until after midnight. The ash cloud was moving faster than predicted. By morning it would reach the eastern edge of Colorado. By tomorrow night it might reach Illinois. I fell asleep on my couch with the TV still on, dreaming about bus routes through empty streets and passengers who never got off at their stops. In my dreams, Mrs. Chen was always crying, always staring out the window at something I couldn't see. When I woke up Wednesday morning, the sky over Chicago had changed. It wasn't gray yet, but it wasn't quite blue either. There was a haze on, the horizon that hadn't been there the day before, and the air smelled different, like dust and something else I couldn't identify. I tried calling Maya again. This time she answered. "Dad, this is crazy," she said. Her voice sounded small and scared. "It's snowing here. In October. In Milwaukee. That's not normal, right?" I looked out my window at the strange haze in the sky and felt something cold settle in my stomach. "No, sweetheart. That's not normal at all. Should I come home? Some of my friends are driving back to their families." I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to tell her to get in her car immediately and drive south to Chicago. But something stopped me. Maybe it was Mrs. Chen's words about the wise bird flying before the landslide. Maybe it was the way the air smelled that morning. Maybe it was just a father's instinct to protect his child. "Stay where you are for now," I told her. "Milwaukee might be safer than Chicago. I'll call you tonight, okay? If things get bad, I'll come get you. Promise?" "I promise." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and realized I'd just made a commitment that might be impossible to keep. Chicago to Milwaukee was 90 miles on a good day, but if the ash cloud hit, if the weather changed, if the roads became impassable, how would I get to her? That's when I started thinking seriously about bus 4427. I'd been driving that particular bus for almost 3 years. I knew every sound it made, every quirk in its transmission, every bump in the seats. More importantly, I knew it was reliable. It had good tires, a strong engine, and enough fuel capacity to travel several hundred miles without stopping. The city hadn't officially suspended bus service yet, but I could see it coming. When the ash cloud hit, when the weather turned, when people stopped showing up for work, Route 23 would be the last thing on anyone's mind. But the bus would still be there, and the fuel would still be there, and somewhere north of the city, Maya would be waiting for her father to keep his promise. I spent Wednesday morning doing my regular route, but everything was different. Fewer passengers, more anxiety, more people looking at the sky like they were waiting for something to fall. The news was full of reports from the western states, ash falling like snow in Denver, flights grounded across the country, emergency declarations in a dozen states. Mrs. Chen wasn't at her usual stop for her dialysis appointment. I waited an extra 5 minutes, something I'd never done before in 18 years of driving. She didn't show up. Tommy was there, though. He'd decided to skip classes and stay with me for another day. His family in Milwaukee was fine, he said, but the weather was getting weird. Cold front moving in, unseasonable snow flurries. We made the same stops we'd made the day before, checking on the same people. Mr. Williams was stocking up on canned goods. The Patels were having a family meeting about whether to close the store temporarily. Everyone was making plans, but nobody was sure what they were planning for. That afternoon, the ash cloud reached Illinois. It started as a haze on the western horizon, like smoke from a distant fire. But it kept growing, kept spreading, until the whole sky took on this gray, dusty color that made everything look like an old photograph. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 2 hours. By evening, it was snowing in Chicago. In October. Fat gray flakes that didn't melt when they hit the ground, because they weren't really snow. They were ash mixed with moisture from the upper atmosphere, falling like nuclear winter made real. That's when I knew Mrs. Chen had been right. This wasn't an emergency that would pass. This was the mountain falling, and I had to decide whether I was going to be the wise bird that flew away, or the one that stayed to warn the others. I tried calling Maya again that night. The call wouldn't go through. Cell towers were getting overloaded, or maybe the weather was affecting the signals. I left a message on her voicemail telling her I loved her and that I'd find a way to reach her soon. By Thursday morning, the sky was the color of concrete, and the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees. It was snowing steadily, but not the kind of snow that makes you think of Christmas or sledding. This was apocalypse snow, gray and gritty and wrong. The city officially suspended all bus service that morning, but I still had keys to bus 4427, and I still had promises to keep. Thursday morning, October 18th, the city looked like it was dying. The snow that had started falling Wednesday night wasn't stopping, and it wasn't melting either. Gray slush piled up on sidewalks and streets, mixed with ash that made everything look dirty and apocalyptic. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees, which should have been impossible for mid-October in Chicago, but impossible had become our new normal. I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Most were from other drivers asking if I knew when service would resume. Some were from passengers who relied on Route 23 to get to work, to medical appointments, to their daily routines that no longer existed. But the one that made my blood run cold was from Tommy Rodriguez. His text was simple. Demo, can't reach my family in Milwaukee. Phone lines down. Going crazy. Here. Meet at campus? I tried calling Maya again, straight to voicemail. The recording was breaking up, filled with static that hadn't been there before. I left another message, telling her to stay safe, telling her I was coming for her. But as I looked out my window at the gray snow falling steadily, I wondered how I was going to keep that promise. The streets were nearly empty as I drove my personal car to the depot. The few people I saw were bundled up like it was January, not October. They moved quickly, heads down, like they didn't want to breathe too much of the ash-filled air. Store windows were either boarded up or displaying hastily written signs, closed until further notice or emergency supplies only. At the depot, I found Joe in the maintenance bay, working on one of the older buses. He looked up when I walked, in his face grim. City's not resuming service anytime soon, he said without me asking. Maybe not ever, the way things are looking. What do you mean? Joe wiped his hands on his coveralls and gestured toward the radio playing in the corner. The news was worse than anything I'd heard before. The ash cloud now covered most of the continental United States. Airports were shut down nationwide. Interstate highways were becoming impassable as the ash mixed with precipitation, creating a slurry that was too thick for normal traffic. It's not just the weather, Joe continued. Supply chains are breaking down. Food deliveries, fuel deliveries, everything that keeps a city running. Chicago's got maybe a week of groceries in the stores, and that's if people don't panic buy everything. First, what about emergency services? Fire department's still running, but they're consolidating stations. Police are focusing on essential areas only. And us? He shrugged. We're officially suspended indefinitely. That's when I told Joe about my plan. Not all of it. Not the part about taking bus 4427 to Milwaukee. Just the part about using the bus to check on passengers who might need help. Joe listened without interrupting, then walked over to the fuel depot controls. You know how much diesel we've got stored here? A lot. Enough to run the entire bus fleet for about 2 weeks under normal conditions, or enough to run one bus for maybe 4 months. He looked at me seriously. That's assuming you could get to the fuel pumps when the backup generator dies. When will that happen? 3 weeks, like I told you before. Maybe less if we keep running lights and heat. For the whole facility. I asked Joe about bus 4427 specifically. He pulled up the maintenance records on his computer, checking the engine condition, tire wear, all the technical details that could mean the difference between life and death on a long journey. She's solid, he said finally. New transmission. Last month, good tires, engine runs clean. If you were hypothetically thinking about taking a long drive, this would be the bus to take. Hypothetically. Joe paused, studying my face. Demo, whatever you're planning, be careful. The world's changing fast, and it's not changing for the better. I found Tommy waiting outside the campus library at UIC. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was probably true. His phone was dead, he said, and the charging stations in his dorm weren't working reliably because of rolling blackouts. I got through to my dad yesterday, he told me as we walked toward where I'd parked my car. For like 2 minutes before the call dropped. He said they're setting up emergency shelters in Milwaukee, but the snow's getting bad there too. Worse than here. What about your sister? That's what's driving me crazy. She was supposed to check in with my parents yesterday after school, but they haven't heard from her. Could be nothing, could be the phones, could be... He didn't finish the sentence. I understood. In a crisis, your imagination fills in all the worst possibilities. Every unanswered call becomes a tragedy. Every hour without contact feels like a lifetime. We drove through the city, and I started to see how quickly civilization was unraveling. The grocery store on Ashland had a line of maybe 50 people waiting outside, and 2 police cars parked nearby. A gas station on Madison had yellow tape around the pumps and a sign saying, "No fuel." But it was the small details that really scared me. Traffic lights that weren't working because of power outages. Abandoned cars on side streets, already partially buried in the gray snow. Windows in apartment buildings that were dark in the middle of the day, either because people had left or because they were conserving power. "It's like a movie," Tommy said quietly. "No," I replied. "Movies have endings." Our first stop was Mr. Williams, the veteran who rode my bus to the VA hospital every Tuesday. He lived in a small apartment near Garfield Park, one of those neighborhoods that was rough even in good times. Now, it felt downright dangerous. Mr. Williams answered his door immediately, like he'd been watching for us through the window. His apartment was warm, heated by a small wood-burning stove that probably wasn't entirely legal in city housing. But legal didn't matter much anymore. "Been expecting you," he said, waving us inside. "Figured you'd come check on folks." His living room was set up like a command center. Battery-powered radio, maps of the city spread across his coffee table, notebooks filled with handwritten information. He'd been tracking the emergency broadcasts, cataloging which services were still running and which had shut down. "VA hospitals, closed," he told us. "Not just for regular appointments, completely closed. They evacuated all the patients to facilities outside the city." "Where?" "Downstate somewhere. Springfield, maybe Peoria. Point is, anyone who was depending on medical care here is out of luck." That hit me hard. Mrs. Chen needed dialysis 3 times a week to stay alive. If the hospitals were closing, if medical services were shutting down, how long did she have? Mr. Williams made us coffee on his wood stove and shared what he'd learned from monitoring emergency frequencies. The National Guard was setting up refugee centers in major cities, but they were overwhelmed. FEMA was coordinating aid, but most of their resources were focused on the western states where the ashfall was heaviest. "Chicago's on its own for now," he said bluntly. "Maybe for a long time." He'd also been in contact with other veterans through ham radio networks. The reports from around the country weren't encouraging. Denver was almost completely cut off. Roads in and out of the city were blocked by ash drifts 20 feet deep. Salt Lake City was under martial law. Phoenix had lost power entirely and was evacuating the entire metropolitan area. "How long do you think this will last?" Tommy asked. Mr. Williams looked at his maps covered in notes and markers. "Son, I lived through Vietnam, and I can tell you that some things don't end. They just become the new normal." From Mr. Williams' place, we drove to the Patel family's store on Halstead. What we found there changed everything. The store was closed, but not in the orderly way businesses usually close. The front window was broken, covered with plywood and duct tape. The open sign was dangling by one chain, spinning slowly in the wind. I knocked on the plywood, calling Mr. Patel's name. After a few minutes, I heard movement inside, then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just wide enough for Mr. Patel's face to appear. "Demo," he said, relief obvious in his voice. "I was hoping you would come." Inside, the store looked like a war zone. Shelves were empty or knocked over. The cash register was open and clearly empty. The family was huddled in the back office behind the counter where they usually sorted lottery tickets and processed money transfers. Mrs. Patel was holding their youngest daughter, Emma, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Their son David, maybe 10, was sitting quietly in the corner with a comic book, but I could tell he was listening to every word the adults said. "What happened?" I asked. Mr. Patel explained that the trouble started Tuesday night, after the first reports about Yellowstone. Wednesday, they'd had their busiest day ever as people stocked up on supplies. But Wednesday night, someone had broken the front window and taken most of their remaining inventory. "Not everything," he said. "They left the milk, the bread, the things that spoil. They took the canned goods, the batteries, the things you need to survive. Did you call the police? Mrs. Patel laughed bitterly. We called. They said they would send someone when they could. That was 12 hours ago. The family had spent the night in the store, afraid to go home to their apartment upstairs, afraid to leave their business unprotected. But they were also afraid to stay. The neighborhood was getting more dangerous by the hour as people grew more desperate. We have relatives in St. Louis, Mr. Patel said. My brother has a motel there. He says we can come, bring the children somewhere safe. That's probably smart, I told him. How are you planning to get there? That's when their situation became clear. Their car had been damaged in the break-in, probably by the same people who robbed the store. The windshield was cracked, and something was wrong with the engine. Even if they could fix it, driving 300 miles in this weather, with ash still falling and roads becoming impassable, would be incredibly dangerous. We were hoping, Mr. Patel said carefully, that maybe you knew someone with a larger vehicle, someone who might be making that trip anyway. I looked at Tommy, and I could see he was thinking the same thing I was. A bus could easily make the trip to St. Louis. It could carry the Patel family and their essential belongings. It could also continue north to Milwaukee, where Tommy's family was waiting and where Maya might need rescue. But taking civilians in a city bus on an unauthorized trip across state lines during a national emergency, that was a line I hadn't crossed yet. That was the difference between being a concerned bus driver checking on passengers and being something else entirely. Let me think about it, I told them. In the meantime, you should gather whatever you need to take with you. Essential documents, medications, warm clothes, travel light, but make sure you have what you need to survive. Our next stop was supposed to be Mrs. Chen's apartment, but we never made it there. As we drove through Chinatown, we could see that something was seriously wrong. There were people in the streets, more people than should have been outside, in this weather. They were gathered in small groups, talking urgently, pointing toward one of the apartment buildings. I parked the car and approached one of the groups. An elderly Chinese man I recognized from riding my bus told me what had happened. The building's heating system had failed during the night. Not just broken down, but failed catastrophically. A pipe had burst, flooding the basement where the boiler was located. With temperatures dropping and no heat, the building had become uninhabitable within hours. Most people have family, have places to go, the man explained. But some of the elderly, the ones who live alone. Mrs. Chen. I ran toward her building, Tommy close behind me. The front door was propped open, and I could feel the cold air rushing out. Inside, the hallways were freezing, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the walls. I climbed to the 4th floor, to Mrs. Chen's apartment. The door was unlocked, which scared me. Mrs. Chen was always careful about security, always had her door locked and chained. Inside, the apartment was empty and cold. Mrs. Chen's carefully maintained furniture, her photos of grandchildren, her jasmine tea set, all abandoned. But there were signs that she'd left in a hurry. Clothes scattered on the bed, like she'd been trying to decide what to pack. A teacup on the kitchen counter still half full. On the kitchen table, I found a note written in English in Mrs. Chen's careful handwriting. Gone to nephew's house on South Side. We'll try to get to dialysis at St. Mary's Hospital. Thank you for being kind, driver. That note broke my heart for reasons I couldn't fully explain at the time. Mrs. Chen had taken the time, in the middle of an emergency evacuation, to leave a note for me. She'd thought about the fact that I might come looking for her, that I might worry. In a city falling apart, she'd still been thinking about other people's feelings. But the note also told me something important. Mrs. Chen was trying to get to dialysis treatments at St. Mary's Hospital on the South Side. If she was walking, if she was relying on public transportation that no longer existed, she might not make it. And if she didn't make her treatments, she had maybe a week before her body started shutting down. Tommy and I spent the next several hours driving around the South Side looking for Mrs. Chen. We checked St. Mary's Hospital first, but they told us they'd stopped providing dialysis services that morning. Equipment problems, they said, but I suspected it was more about staff shortages and supply chain issues. We drove through neighborhoods I'd never seen before, following the bus routes that other drivers worked, looking for an elderly Chinese woman who might be staying with relatives. It was like looking for one specific snowflake in a blizzard. By late afternoon, we'd covered maybe 20 square miles of the city and found nothing. The snow was getting heavier, the visibility was getting worse, and my car was starting to struggle with the slush and ash mixture coating the roads. That's when Tommy asked the question I'd been avoiding all day. "Demo, what are we really doing here?" We were sitting in my car outside a community center on the south side, watching people stream in and out carrying boxes and blankets. The city had set up another emergency warming center, but it was already overcrowded. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've been driving around all day trying to help people, but we're not really helping anyone. The Patels are still trapped in their store. Mrs. Chen is still missing. My family is still unreachable in Milwaukee. Your daughter is still stuck in a snowstorm 90 miles away." He was right, and I knew it. We were playing at being helpful, while the real problems got bigger every hour. "We're just two guys in a car," Tommy continued. "But you've got access to a bus, a big bus that could actually transport people, that could actually get families to safety." "Tommy, taking a city bus without authorization? Demo, there is no authorization anymore. The city suspended service indefinitely. The mayor's probably not even in Chicago right now. Half the city council evacuated yesterday. Who exactly are you waiting for permission from?" That night I lay awake in my apartment thinking about everything Tommy had said. The radio was playing emergency broadcasts, but they were mostly automated. Messages telling people to stay indoors and conserve supplies. No new information, no updates on when services might resume, no indication that anyone was coming to help. I tried calling Maya one more time before bed. This time the call went through for about 30 seconds before cutting out. Long enough for me to hear her voice, scared and small, saying, "Dad, I don't know what to do. The snow here is crazy, and they're talking about evacuating the whole university. Some of my friends already left, but I don't have anywhere to go." The line went dead before I could respond. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I was going to take bus 4427. I was going to load it with supplies and passengers and drive north to Milwaukee to find my daughter. Along the way, I was going to help anyone I could help. It wasn't legal. It probably wasn't smart. But it was the only plan I had that might actually save someone. Friday morning, October 19th, I woke up to a city that looked completely different from the one I'd known for 47 years. The snow had continued falling all night, mixed with ash that made everything look gray and dirty. The temperature was 28 degrees, which meant the slush from previous days was now frozen into treacherous, irregular ice. More importantly, Chicago was quiet in a way that big cities are never supposed to be quiet. No traffic noise, no construction sounds, no normal urban buzz of activity. Just the wind and the occasional sound of emergency sirens in the distance. I drove to the depot through empty streets, passing abandoned cars and dark storefronts. The few people I saw were moving with purpose, heads down, carrying bags or pushing shopping carts loaded with supplies. Nobody was out for casual reasons anymore. At the depot, I found Joe already working as I'd expected. He was a creature of habit, and even the end of the world wasn't going to change his routine. "Morning, Demo," he said, looking up from a bus engine he was servicing. "You're up early for someone who doesn't officially have a job anymore. Can't sleep." "Yeah, I know the feeling." He wiped his hands on a rag and gestured toward the radio. "News is getting worse. They're calling it a volcanic winter now, saying it could last months, maybe years." "Years?" Joe nodded grimly. "Happened. Before, apparently. Some volcano in Indonesia back in the 1800s. Caused crop failures worldwide, famine, all sorts of problems. But that was nothing compared to this." He showed me the latest reports he'd been monitoring on emergency frequencies. The ashfall was continuing across most of the United States. Average temperatures had dropped 15 to 20 degrees nationwide. Agricultural areas in the Midwest were reporting complete crop failures. "The thing is," Joe continued, "this isn't just about weather. It's about food production, transportation networks, power generation. Everything we depend on to keep society running. That's when I told Joe about my real plan, not just using the bus to check on passengers, but taking it north to Milwaukee to find Maya, carrying anyone who needed transport along the way. Joe listened without comment, then walked over to bus 4427 and opened the engine compartment. He spent several minutes checking fluid levels, inspecting belts, testing various systems. "She'll make the trip," he said finally. "Question is whether you will." "What do you mean?" "Demo, you're talking about driving a stolen city bus 300 miles through the worst weather emergency in modern history, carrying civilian passengers with no official authorization and no backup support. If you break down, if you run out of fuel, if you encounter hostile people or law enforcement, you're on your own." "I know." "Do you?" Joe's voice was serious. "Because once you drive that bus off this lot, there's no coming back. You won't be a city employee who bent some rules to help people. You'll be a guy who stole a bus during a national emergency. That's federal crime territory." I understood what he was saying, but I also understood that doing nothing was becoming impossible. Every hour I waited, the situation got worse. The Patels were still trapped in their destroyed store. Mrs. Chen was still missing and running out of time before her body started failing without dialysis. Maya was still stuck in Milwaukee with no way to get home. "I have to do something, Joe. I can't just sit here and wait for someone else to fix this." Joe studied my face for a long moment, then walked over to the fuel depot controls. "Well, if you're going to do something stupid, you might as well do it with a full tank." He began the process of fueling bus 4427, filling not just the main tank, but also the auxiliary tank that was normally used only for long-distance charter services. When he was finished, the bus had enough fuel to travel almost 600 miles without stopping. "That should get you to Milwaukee and back, with some to spare," he said. "But Demo, listen to me carefully. This fuel represents about 2 weeks of normal operations for our entire fleet. If you take this bus, you're taking resources that could help a lot of people in other ways. I'll make it count. You better." Joe handed me a clipboard with maintenance records and operational checklists. "And you better come back alive, because if you get yourself killed being a hero, I'm going to be very annoyed." As I prepared to leave the depot, Joe gave me one more piece of advice that turned out to be more important than I realized at the time. "Demo, you're going to have to make choices out there. Hard choices about who you help and who you don't. When that happens, remember that you can't save everyone, but you damn well better save someone." I loaded bus 4427 with emergency supplies from the depot's storage room. Blankets, first aid kits, emergency flares, basic tools. I also took some of the food from the employee break room, mostly canned goods and packaged snacks that would keep for a long time. Then I began the process of gathering passengers for a journey that would either save lives or get us all killed. My first stop was the Patel family's store. When I pulled bus 4427 up to the curb, on Halstead Street, I could see faces appearing in windows throughout the neighborhood. A city bus running during the emergency suspension was unusual enough that people noticed. Mr. Patel opened the plywood-covered door before I could knock. His face showed relief, mixed with disbelief, when he saw me standing there in my official driver's uniform next to a fully operational CTA bus. "Demo, is service resuming?" he asked hopefully. "No," I told him, "but I'm making a run north toward Milwaukee. There's space for your family if you want to get to St. Louis." Inside the destroyed store, the Patel family had spent another sleepless night. Mrs. Patel looked exhausted, and little Emma was clinging to her mother like she was afraid to let go. David, their 10-year-old son, was trying to act brave, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "How is this possible?" Mrs. Patel asked, as I explained my plan. "The city said all buses were suspended." "They are suspended," I said. "This isn't an official route. This is me using a bus to help people who need help." Mr. Patel understood immediately. He'd lived through enough emergencies to recognize the difference between official help and the kind of help that actually shows up when you need it. "What about your job?" he asked. "I don't think I have a job anymore. I don't think any of us have jobs anymore." The family gathered their essential belongings while I waited. It was heartbreaking to watch them choose what to take from a life they'd built over 15 years in Chicago. Photo albums made the cut. The cash register did not. Warm clothes for the children were essential. The inventory records for their destroyed business stayed behind. Mrs. Patel packed medications for Emma, who had asthma, and for Mr. Patel's diabetes. Those medications represented maybe a 2-week supply, and there was no guarantee they'd be able to get refills wherever they ended up. As we loaded their belongings into the bus, Mr. Patel pulled me aside. "Demo, this is very dangerous for you. Taking people in a city bus without permission." "Everything's dangerous now," I replied. "At least this way, we're dangerous together." Our next stop was supposed to be finding Mrs. Chen, but I'd made a decision during the night. We were going to check the nephew's house where her note said she'd gone, but we were also going to check every dialysis center between there and our route north. If Mrs. Chen was still in the city and still trying to get treatment, we'd find her. Tommy met us at the campus carrying a single backpack and his laptop. He'd spent the morning trying to reach his family in Milwaukee through every communication method he could think of. Email, social media, even trying to contact his father's fire station directly. Nothing was getting through reliably. "Any word from Maya?" he asked as he climbed aboard the bus. "I got through for 30 seconds last night. She's scared and they're talking about evacuating the university, but I don't know anything beyond that." The Patel children were fascinated by being passengers on an empty city bus. Emma asked if she could sit in the front seat like she'd seen other kids do, and I told her she could sit anywhere she wanted. Under normal circumstances, passengers weren't allowed in the front seats, but these weren't normal circumstances. David pulled out a small notebook and started writing down everything he saw as we drove through the city. Street names, building conditions, how many cars were abandoned on different blocks. I realized he was documenting the end of the world as he understood it, creating a record of what Chicago looked like when civilization started breaking down. Our first stop looking for Mrs. Chen was the address from her note, a small house in Bridgeport where her nephew supposedly lived. The house was dark and nobody answered when we knocked. A neighbor told us that the family had left 2 days earlier, heading south to relatives in Tennessee. "Did they have an elderly woman with them?" I asked. "Maybe," the neighbor said. "Hard to tell. They left real early in the morning before most folks were awake." That could have been Mrs. Chen, or it could have been anyone, but it meant she wasn't at the nephew's house anymore, and we had no idea where she might have gone. We spent the next 3 hours checking every medical facility on the south side that had provided dialysis services. Most were closed completely. The few that were still operating had skeletal staffs and were only treating their most critical patients. At the third facility we checked, a clinic near Midway Airport, we finally got some useful information. A nurse there remembered an elderly Chinese woman who'd come in Thursday morning asking about dialysis treatments. "We couldn't help her," the nurse explained. "Our machine was down and we were already over capacity with our regular patients, but I gave her a list of other places to try." The nurse still had a copy of that list. Most of the facilities on it were in the northern suburbs, places that would be difficult to reach without a car and nearly impossible in the current weather conditions. "Did she say where she was staying?" Tommy asked. "She mentioned something about a church. Said there was a church on the north side that was helping people with nowhere to go." A church on the north side. In a city with hundreds of churches, that wasn't much to go on. But it was more than we'd had before. As we continued searching, I started to understand the impossible mathematics of survival during a collapse. Every person we helped took time and resources. Every detour we made to look for Mrs. Chen was time we weren't using to get the Patel family to safety or to reach Maya in Milwaukee. Every gallon of fuel we burned searching was a gallon we wouldn't have for the journey north. But I also understood that this was exactly the kind of choice that Mrs. Chen had warned me about. The choice between being the wise bird that flies away and the one that stays to warn others. I was trying to do both, and it might not be possible. By early afternoon, we'd covered most of the south side and found nothing concrete about Mrs. Chen's whereabouts. The snow was getting heavier and the temperature was dropping again. Weather reports, when we could get them on the radio, were predicting another significant storm system moving in from the west. That's when Mrs. Patel made a suggestion that changed our approach entirely. "Demo," she said from her seat near the middle of the bus. "What if we put out a message on the radio, ask people to help us find her?" Several of the emergency radio stations were still broadcasting, and some were taking messages from listeners. We found a station that was relaying information about missing persons and emergency situations. I called in and left a message. "Looking for Mrs. Chen, elderly Chinese woman, needs dialysis treatment. Last seen Thursday in Bridgeport area, possibly staying at a church on North Side. Contact CTA bus 4427 if you have information." It was a long shot, but it was better than driving around the city randomly, and it gave us a reason to keep the radio on, monitoring for any response while we continued with our journey. Our next pickup was Mr. Williams, the veteran from Garfield Park. When we pulled up to his building, he was waiting outside with a military-style duffel bag and a smaller bag that I recognized as a medical kit. "Heard your message on the radio," he said as he climbed aboard. Smart thinking. Mr. Williams had been monitoring emergency frequencies all morning, and he had updates on the situation that made our journey seem even more urgent. Roads throughout Illinois and Wisconsin were becoming impassable. The National Guard was setting up checkpoints on major highways, but they were overwhelmed and understaffed. "Interstate 94 north of the city is still open," he told us, "but they're saying it might close completely if this next storm system is as bad as they're predicting." "When is that supposed to hit?" Tommy asked. "Tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. Depends on how fast it's moving." That meant we had maybe 12 hours to reach Milwaukee before travel became impossible. It also meant that if we were going to find Mrs. Chen, we needed to find her soon. Mr. Williams also brought news about the refugee centers that were being set up in surrounding states. Wisconsin was accepting people from Illinois, but only at designated locations. Missouri was doing the same for people heading south. The informal network of people helping people, the kind of mutual aid that Mrs. Chen had relied on when she went to stay with her nephew, was breaking down as resources became scarce. "People are getting desperate," Mr. Williams said. And desperate. People make dangerous choices. As if to prove his point, we encountered our first real problem about an hour later. We were driving through a neighborhood on the west side, following up on a radio call that someone thought they'd seen an elderly Asian woman at a community center, when we came across a checkpoint that definitely wasn't official. 3 cars were blocking the street, and several men with heavy coats and baseball bats were stopping vehicles. They weren't wearing uniforms, and they weren't law enforcement. They were just residents who'd decided to control access to their neighborhood. I stopped the bus about 50 feet away from the improvised roadblock and put it in park. Through the windshield, I could see the men talking among themselves and pointing at our bus. "What do we do?" Tommy asked quietly. Mr. Williams was already moving toward the front of the bus. "Let me handle this," he said. "I've dealt with situations like this before." But before any of us could get off the bus, one of the men approached our door. He was maybe 40 years old, wearing a thick winter coat and carrying what looked like a tire iron. I opened the door, and he climbed up the first step. "This is a private neighborhood," he said. "We're not letting any more refugees through." "We're not refugees," I replied. "We're looking for someone, an elderly woman who might need medical help." "Yeah, well, we're looking for people who aren't going to steal our food and take our supplies. You turn this bus around and find another route." Behind him, I could see more men gathering. Some were carrying improvised weapons, and all of them looked like they were prepared to use them. Mr. Williams stepped forward. "Sir, we understand you're trying to protect your community. We respect that. But we're just passing through and we're looking for someone who might die without medical attention. That's not our problem." The situation was escalating quickly. I could feel the tension on the bus, especially from the Patel family. Emma was crying quietly and Mrs. Patel was holding her close. David was still taking notes in his notebook, but his handwriting was shakier now. That's when I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. "You're right," I told the man with the tire iron. This isn't your problem, but maybe we can help you with your problems. I explained that we had emergency supplies on the bus. Medical kit, emergency flares, some food, nothing they couldn't use in their own community. I offered to share some of our supplies in exchange for safe passage and any information they might have about Mrs. Chen. The negotiation took about 20 minutes. In the end, we traded half of our emergency food supply and most of our flares for safe passage through their neighborhood and a promise that they'd put the word out on their radio network about Mrs. Chen. As we drove away from the checkpoint, Mr. Williams shook his head. That's going to happen more and more, he said. Communities turning inward, suspicious of outsiders. It's human nature during a crisis. Will we have enough supplies for the trip north? Mrs. Patel asked. We'll have to be more careful, I admitted, but we'll make it work. What I didn't say was that the encounter had taught me something important about the new world we were living in. Help was going to come with a price. Trust was going to be earned, not given. And every mile of our journey was going to require negotiations and compromises I'd never had to make as a regular bus driver. An hour later, we got our first real break in finding Mrs. Chen. The radio crackled with a response to our earlier message. A woman's voice, barely audible through the static, said she thought she'd seen an elderly Chinese woman at St. Alphonsus Church on the north side. The woman was with a group of people who'd lost their housing due to heating failures, and the church was providing temporary shelter. St. Alphonsus was about 15 miles from our current location, but it was roughly on our route toward the highway that would take us north to Milwaukee. We could check for Mrs. Chen without losing much time from our journey. The church was in a neighborhood that looked like it had been hit harder than most places. More abandoned cars, more broken windows, more signs of people having left quickly. But the church itself was a beacon of activity in the middle of the deterioration. Cars and trucks were parked around the building, and I could see people moving in and out, carrying boxes and bags. Someone had set up a large tent in the parking lot, and there were people gathered around what looked like a cooking area. I parked the bus across the street from the church and told everyone to stay inside while Tommy and I went to inquire about Mrs. Chen. The scene inside the church was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The pews had been moved aside, and the main floor was covered with sleeping bags, air mattresses, and makeshift family areas marked off by hanging blankets. There had to be at least 60 people taking shelter there, ranging from families with small children to elderly individuals who'd been displaced from senior housing. A priest, Father Martinez, greeted us near the entrance. He was a young man, probably in his 30s, but he looked like he'd aged years in the past week. "Are you here for shelter?" he asked. "We're pretty full, but we can always find space for a few more." "We're looking for someone," I explained. "An elderly Chinese woman named Mrs. Chen. We heard she might be staying here." Father Martinez's face lit up. "Mrs. Chen, yes. She's been helping in the kitchen. Amazing woman. She's been teaching some of the other residents how to make soup stretch further, how to prepare rice for large groups." He led us toward the back of the church where a temporary kitchen had been set up in what used to be a Sunday school classroom. And there, stirring a large pot of soup and chatting with 2 other women, was Mrs. Chen. She looked up when she saw me, and her face showed surprise and relief in equal measure. "Demo," she said, setting down her ladle and coming over to us. "You came looking for me." "Of course I did. You're one of my passengers." Mrs. Chen smiled, but I could see she was weaker than when I'd last seen her. Her skin had a grayish color that I'd learned to recognize from other passengers who'd had medical issues. "When was your last dialysis treatment?" I asked. "Tuesday," she admitted. "I tried to get to the centers on the list the nurse gave me, but the buses aren't running, and walking in this weather." Tuesday. It was now Friday afternoon. Mrs. Chen had missed 2 treatments, and her body was starting to show the effects of toxins building up in her blood. "There's a dialysis center in Milwaukee," Tommy said. "My cousin mentioned it when I was trying to reach my family. St. Mary's Hospital. There has a full renal unit." Mrs. Chen looked between Tommy and me, understanding what we were suggesting. "You want me to come with you to Milwaukee?" "I want you to come with us to a place where you can get the medical care you need to stay alive," I said. Father Martinez had been listening to our conversation. "Mrs. Chen, these gentlemen are offering you a chance to get proper medical care. I think you should go with them. But the people here need help. I've been organizing the kitchen, helping coordinate food distribution. And you've done wonderful work," the priest said gently. "But Mrs. Chen, you can't help anyone if you don't take care of yourself first." It took another hour to convince Mrs. Chen to come with us. She insisted on finishing the soup she'd been preparing, and she wanted to say goodbye to the other residents. She'd been helping. But eventually she gathered her few belongings and allowed us to help her onto the bus. The Patel family welcomed her warmly, and Emma immediately took to her, asking questions about China and about the soup she'd been making. Mrs. Chen settled into a seat near the front and immediately began worrying about whether we had enough food for everyone on the bus. As we prepared to leave the church, Father Martinez pulled me aside. "Where exactly are you taking these people?" he asked. "The Patels have family in St. Louis. Mrs. Chen needs medical care in Milwaukee. Tommy and I are looking for my daughter at the University of Wisconsin. And you're doing this in a city bus without official authorization?" "Yes." Father Martinez was quiet for a moment. "In seminary, they teach you about the difference between what's legal and what's moral. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they're not." He handed me a piece of paper with radio frequencies and contact information for churches and aid organizations along major highways between Chicago and Milwaukee. "In case you need help," he explained. "There are good people trying to do good work in bad circumstances, but be careful who you trust." As we finally left St. Alphonsus Church, I felt like we'd accomplished something important. We'd found Mrs. Chen and we were getting her toward medical care that might save her life. We had the Patel family safely aboard and heading toward their relatives in St. Louis. We were making progress toward Milwaukee and toward finding Maya. But I also felt the weight of new responsibilities. Every person on the bus was now depending on me to make decisions that could determine whether they lived or died. The fuel gauge showed we were using more gas than I'd calculated, partly because of the extra driving we'd done searching for Mrs. Chen. The weather was getting worse, and the radio report suggested that the storm system moving in from the west was going to be more severe than originally predicted. Most importantly, I was starting to understand that our journey north was going to involve more than just driving from point A to point B. We were going to encounter more checkpoints, more desperate people, more situations where we'd have to choose between helping others and protecting the people already under our care. As we merged onto the highway heading north toward the Wisconsin border, Mrs. Chen moved to the seat directly behind me. "Demo," she said quietly, "thank you for coming back for me. I told you I would check on you. You did more than check on me. You saved my life." I wanted to tell her that we weren't safe yet, that we still had to reach Milwaukee and find working dialysis equipment and get through whatever obstacles were waiting for us on the road ahead. But I also understood that Mrs. Chen was thanking me for something more than just transportation. She was thanking me for remembering that she mattered, for treating her like a person worth saving instead of just another casualty of an impossible situation. "Mrs. Chen," I said, "remember what you told me about the wise bird and the landslide?" "Yes. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the gray landscape passing by. "Demo, what did you understand?" "That sometimes the wise thing to do is stay and help, even when flying away would be safer." Mrs. Chen nodded. "But also that you cannot save everyone. You can only save the ones you choose to save." As we drove north through the gathering storm, I thought about the people we'd left behind, the folks still at St. Alphonsus Church, the residents of the West Side neighborhood who'd blocked the road, all the passengers from my regular route who I hadn't been able to find or help. Mrs. Chen was right. I couldn't save everyone. But I was going to do everything in my power to save the 7 people on bus 4427 who had trusted me, enough to bet their lives on my ability to get them where they needed to go. The highway stretched ahead of us, disappearing into gray snow and an uncertain future. But for the first time since this crisis began, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. The highway north of Chicago looked like something from a disaster movie. Interstate 94, which should have been packed with Friday afternoon traffic, was nearly empty except for abandoned vehicles buried under gray snow and the occasional military convoy heading south. The few cars we passed were overloaded, with belongings, families fleeing north just like we were. About 20 miles outside the city, we encountered our first official checkpoint. 2 National Guard vehicles were parked across both lanes, with soldiers directing the few travelers into a single file. I could see they were checking identification and asking questions before allowing people to continue. "What do we tell them?" Tommy asked from his seat behind me. "The truth," I replied. "We're transporting people who need medical care and family reunification." Mr. Williams moved toward the front of the bus. "Demo, let me do the talking. I know how to deal with military personnel." When our turn came, a young sergeant approached the bus door. He couldn't have been more than 25, but his face showed the exhaustion of someone who'd been working without sleep for days. "Good afternoon," he said as I opened the door. "Where are you folks headed?" "Milwaukee," Mr. Williams answered before I could speak. "We have an elderly woman who needs dialysis treatment and a family trying to reach relatives." The sergeant looked past Mr. Williams at our passengers, Mrs. Chen, obviously frail and ill, the Patel family with their 2 young children, Tommy, with his college backpack. All of us clearly civilians in obvious need. "This is a CTA bus," the sergeant observed. "Are you operating under emergency authorization?" That was the question I'd been dreading. Mr. Williams stepped in smoothly. "Sergeant, we're operating under the authority of basic human decency. This driver is using his own resources and putting himself at risk to help people who would otherwise die." The sergeant studied Mr. Williams's face, taking in his bearing and the way he spoke. "Military recognizes military, even when one is retired." "You serve?" the sergeant asked. "Vietnam," Mr. Williams replied. "Long time ago." The sergeant was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with regulations versus common sense. Finally, he stepped back from the bus. "Milwaukee's got refugee centers set up at the fairgrounds and at 3 schools," he said. "Medical facilities are operating on emergency protocols only. Make sure your lady gets to Frodtert Hospital. That's where they're concentrating dialysis patients." He waved us through without checking identification or asking more questions. As we drove away, I realized that Mr. Williams had just saved us from what could have been a major problem. "Thank you," I said. "Military folks understand mission flexibility," he replied. "That kid knew we were trying to help people, and that was enough." But the checkpoint had cost us time, and the weather was getting worse. The snow was falling heavier now, mixed with ash that made it difficult to see more than a few hundred feet ahead. The bus was handling well, but I could feel the wheels slipping occasionally on the increasingly treacherous road surface. About 40 miles north of Chicago, we encountered a problem that no amount of military courtesy could solve. Traffic ahead of us had come to a complete stop. Not slow traffic, not a minor delay, but a total standstill stretching as far as I could see through the snow. I put the bus in park and turned on the emergency flashers. "What's happening?" Mrs. Patel asked, holding Emma close as the little girl pressed her face against the window. I grabbed the radio and tried to contact other drivers or emergency services for information. After several minutes of static, I reached a state highway patrol dispatcher. "Interstate 94 northbound is blocked at mile marker 68, the dispatcher reported. "Multiple vehicle accident involving a jackknifed semi-truck. Road crews are trying to clear it, but with current weather conditions, estimated time for reopening is 6 to 8 hours. 6 to 8 hours. We didn't have 6 to 8 hours. The storm system that was moving in would make travel impossible by morning, and Mrs. Chen needed medical attention soon. Her condition was clearly deteriorating, even in the short time since we'd picked her up from the church. "Are there alternate routes?" I asked the dispatcher. "Negative. Secondary roads in the area are already impassable due to snow accumulation. Your best option is to wait for the main highway to reopen." I turned off the radio and looked at my passengers. 7 people who had trusted me to get them to safety, and we were stuck in the middle of nowhere with a storm getting worse by the hour. That's when David Patel, the 10-year-old who'd been taking notes throughout our journey, spoke up from his seat near the middle of the bus. "Mr. Demo," he said, "what about the other highway?" "What other highway?" David pulled out a road atlas that he'd been consulting during our trip. Kids these days might be used to GPS, but David was old school, following our route on paper. Maps. "There's another interstate that goes to Milwaukee," he said, pointing at the map. "Interstate 43. It connects with Highway 14 about 20 miles west of here." I studied the map David was showing me. He was right. There was an alternate route that would take us west before turning north toward Milwaukee. It would add maybe 50 miles to our journey, but if the main highway was blocked, it might be our only option. Mr. Williams looked at the map over my shoulder. "That route goes through smaller towns," he said. "Might not be plowed as well, but it also might not have the traffic problems." "How's our fuel situation?" Tommy asked. I checked the gauge. We'd used more fuel than I'd planned due to the extra driving in Chicago and the slow progress through the snow. We had maybe enough to reach Milwaukee on the direct route, but the alternate route would push us close to empty. "We'll have to risk it," I decided. Mrs. Chen can't wait 6 hours for the highway to reopen. Getting off the interstate and onto local roads required some creative driving. The exit ramps weren't plowed, and I had to use the bus's weight and momentum to push through snowdrifts that would have stopped a regular car. The secondary roads were even worse than I'd expected. In some places, we were the first vehicle to travel them since the snow started falling. I had to drive slowly, testing the road surface constantly, using the bus's size and power to break through areas where the snow was too deep for smaller vehicles. But we were making progress, and, more importantly, we weren't stuck in a traffic jam on the interstate. About an hour into the detour, we reached a small town called Cedar Falls. The main street was lined with old brick buildings, most of them dark, but I could see lights in a few storefronts and what looked like a diner that was still operating. "We should stop," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "I need to use facilities, and we should check if they have food." I pulled the bus up in front of the diner. Through the windows, I could see maybe a dozen people inside, local residents who were weathering the storm in a place with heat and coffee. Tommy and I went inside first to assess the situation. The diner was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of coffee and fried food. The conversation stopped when we walked in, and I could feel everyone studying us. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, approached our table. "You folks traveling through?" she asked. "Heading to Milwaukee," I replied. "We've got some people on our bus who need medical attention." "Milwaukee's a long way in this weather." "Yes, ma'am, it is." She was quiet for a moment, studying our faces. "You hungry?" "We've got soup, sandwiches, coffee. Not much else with the supply trucks not getting through." I ordered food for everyone on the bus and asked if we could bring our passengers inside to warm up. The waitress agreed, and within a few minutes the diner was filled with our small group mixing with the local residents. The people of Cedar Falls were curious about our journey but not suspicious. They'd been dealing with stranded travelers for several days, and they understood that people were trying to get to family or medical care. Mrs. Chen sat with 2 elderly local women, and within minutes they were sharing stories about grandchildren and comparing recipes. Emma Patel made friends with a local family's daughter, and soon both girls were drawing pictures on napkins while their parents talked about the strange weather and what it might mean for the future. But it was David who provided the most important intelligence about our route ahead. He'd been studying his road atlas and talking with a local man who drove truck routes throughout Wisconsin. The man told David that Highway 14 north of town had been plowed that morning, but that the storm was expected to intensify overnight. "If you're going to make it to Milwaukee tonight," the trucker said, "you need to leave within the next hour. After that, the roads are going to be too dangerous, even for a big vehicle like your bus." That gave us a deadline. We could rest and warm up for 45 minutes, but then we had to get back on the road regardless of weather conditions. As we prepared to leave Cedar Falls, the waitress refused payment for our food. "You folks are trying to help people," she said. "That's payment enough." But the local trucker approached me as we were loading back onto the bus. He handed me a CB radio and a sheet of paper with frequency information. Channel 19 is the trucker's frequency, he explained. If you run into trouble on the road ahead, someone might be listening who can help. And here's the frequencies for emergency services in the counties you'll be driving through. He also gave me something else. A 5-gallon container of diesel, fuel. You're going to need every drop you can get, he said. That storm's going to make your engine work harder, use more fuel. As we pulled away from Cedar Falls, I felt like we'd experienced something important. In a world that was falling apart, we'd found a pocket of community and kindness. People who barely knew us had fed us, warmed us, and given us resources we needed to continue our journey. But we were also racing against time and weather that was getting worse by the hour. Highway 14 north of Cedar Falls was a 2-lane road through rural Wisconsin farmland. Under normal conditions, it would have been a pleasant drive through small towns and agricultural areas. Under current conditions, it was a test of nerves and driving skill. The snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see the road markings. I had to rely on fence posts and mailboxes to stay on the pavement. Several times I felt the bus slide sideways before the tires found traction again. Mrs. Chen had moved to the seat directly behind me, partly to be closer to the heater, but also because I think she wanted to be available if I needed help staying alert. Every few minutes she would point out a road sign or landmark that she could see before I could. "Demo," she said during one particularly difficult stretch. "Do you want me to watch the radio? Monitor for emergency information?" "That would be helpful." Mrs. Chen took over communications while I focused entirely on driving. She monitored both the emergency frequencies and the trucker channel, listening for road conditions, weather, updates, and any other information that might affect our journey. About 30 miles north of Cedar Falls, she heard something that made us all pay attention. "Demo, there's a report of another accident on Interstate 94, but also they're saying that Interstate 43 north of Milwaukee is still open. If we can reach it, we should be able to get into the city." "How much further to Interstate 43? Tommy consulted David's atlas. "Maybe 40 miles, but we have to get through 2 more small towns first." The first town, Elkhorn, was completely dark. Power outage, according to a brief radio report Mrs. Chen picked up. We drove through empty streets lined with snow-covered cars and houses with no lights in the windows. It felt like driving through a ghost town. The second town, East Troy, was partially lit but clearly under stress. We could see emergency vehicles parked at what looked like a high school, probably another refugee center. Part of me wanted to stop and offer help, but we were running low on fuel and time. "We can't help everyone," Mrs. Chen said quietly, as if she could read my thoughts. "I know, but it's hard to drive past people who might need help. Demo, the people on this bus need you to get them to Milwaukee. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is complete the mission you've already committed to." By the time we reached Interstate 43, it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. The fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and the storm was at its worst. Visibility was maybe 50 feet, and the wind was strong enough to rock the bus occasionally, but we were only 30 miles from Milwaukee. The interstate was nearly empty, but it was plowed and passable. For the first time in hours, I was able to drive faster than 20 miles per hour. We were going to make it. That's when the engine started making a noise I'd never heard before. It wasn't the normal rumble of the diesel engine. It was a higher-pitched sound, almost like a whining, that seemed to be coming from somewhere in the transmission or drivetrain. "What's that noise?" Tommy asked. I eased off the accelerator and listened carefully. The sound continued, but it didn't seem to be getting worse immediately. "Probably just strain from driving in these conditions," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "The engine's been working hard for hours." But Mr. Williams had moved toward the front of the bus, and I could see concern on his face. He'd been around enough vehicles to recognize when something wasn't right. "Demo," he said quietly. "We should start looking for a place to stop. Somewhere with shelter in case we have mechanical problems." The idea of breaking down 30 miles from Milwaukee with Mrs. Chen needing immediate medical attention and the worst storm in decades raging outside was terrifying. But Mr. Williams was right. If the bus was going to fail, we needed to be somewhere with options, not stranded on an empty highway. According to the road signs, there was a truck stop at the next exit. Truck stops meant fuel, food, and most importantly, mechanics who might be able to help with our engine problem. But as we took the exit, the engine noise got worse. And for the first time since we'd left Chicago, I started to wonder if our journey was going to end in failure, 30 miles short of our destination. The truck stop was still operating, but just barely. Half the parking lot was empty, and only a few of the fuel pumps were working. But there were lights on in the main building, and I could see several big rigs parked near the maintenance bays. I pulled bus 4427 up to the building and shut off the engine. In the sudden silence, I could hear the wind howling outside and the worried breathing of my passengers. "Everyone stay on the bus while I check out the situation," I announced. "We're going to get through this, but I need to assess our options." As I stepped off the bus into the storm, I couldn't help thinking about Mrs. Chen's words about wise birds and landslides. We'd made it this far by making difficult choices and taking calculated risks. Now we needed one more stroke of luck to complete our mission. The truck stop might be our salvation, or it might be where our journey ended. But either way, we were going to face it together. Inside the truck stop, I found exactly what we needed. A mechanic named Carlos, who was pulling an all-night shift helping stranded drivers. He was a man in his 40s with grease-stained coveralls and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from fixing broken things for a living. "Bus sounds like transmission trouble," he said, after I described the noise we'd been hearing. "Could be low fluid, could be something more serious. Let me take a look." While Carlos examined the bus, I explained our situation to the truck stop manager, a woman named Linda who'd been keeping the place running despite half her staff not showing up for work. "We've got an elderly woman who needs dialysis in Milwaukee," I told her. "If we can't fix the bus, is there any other way to get her there tonight?" Linda looked out at the storm raging in the parking lot. "Honey, ain't nobody driving to Milwaukee in this weather unless it's life or death." "It is life or death." That changed everything. Linda immediately got on her CB radio, putting out a call to any drivers who might be heading north toward Milwaukee. Within 10 minutes, she'd found a trucker named Pete who was making a delivery, run to a hospital in the city. But Carlos returned with news about the bus that complicated our options. "You've got a transmission leak," he told me. "Not catastrophic yet, but you're losing fluid steadily. I can top it off and add some stop leak compound, but you're looking at maybe 20 miles before it fails completely." 20 miles, we were 30 miles from Milwaukee. Even if we could nurse the bus another 20 miles, we'd still be 10 miles short of our destination when the transmission gave out completely. "Is there any way to fix it properly?" I asked. Carlos shook his head. "Not here, not tonight. This is the kind of repair that needs a shop with a lift and specialized equipment." That's when Mr. Williams suggested the solution that saved us all. "We split up," he said simply. "Mrs. Chen goes with the trucker to get immediate medical care. The rest of us try to make it to Milwaukee in the bus, and if we break down, at least we've gotten the most critical person to safety." It was a logical plan, but it meant breaking up our group. Mrs. Chen would be traveling with a stranger, and the rest of us would be risking getting stranded if the bus failed. "I don't want to leave you," Mrs. Chen said when I explained the situation to her. "Mrs. Chen, you need medical attention tonight. If you stay with us and the bus breaks down, you could die." She was quiet for a moment, looking around at the other passengers who had become like family during our journey. "Demo, promise me you'll get the Patel family to their relatives. Promise me you'll find your daughter." "I promise." The trucker, Pete, was a decent man who understood the urgency of the situation. He helped Mrs. Chen gather her few belongings and made sure she was comfortable in his truck's sleeper cab. Before they left, she hugged each of us, spending the Yahtzee. Longest time with little Emma Patel. "Be brave," she told Emma, "and remember what we talked about on the bus about helping people even when it's difficult." As Pete's truck pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared into the storm, I felt like I was losing a piece of our mission. But I also knew we'd made the right choice. Mrs. Chen was going to get the medical care she needed, and that had been our primary responsibility since we'd found her at the church. Carlos finished working on our transmission, adding fluid and stop leak compound while warning us that we were operating on borrowed time. "Drive gentle. he advised. No sudden acceleration, no hard stops. Keep the RPMs low and pray the leak doesn't get worse. We also refueled the bus using the diesel Carlos had brought from the trucker in Cedar Falls, plus what we could afford to purchase at the truck stop. It wasn't a full tank, but it was enough to reach Milwaukee if the transmission held out. Linda refused to let us pay for Carlos's labor. You folks are doing something important, she said. Least we can do is help you get there. As we prepared to leave the truck stop, I felt the weight of leadership more heavily than ever. 6 people were still depending on me to make the right decisions, and every choice from here on out would determine whether we reached safety or ended up stranded in the storm. The drive from the truck stop toward Milwaukee was the most stressful 25 miles of my life. Every sound from the engine made me think the transmission was about to fail. Every slight vibration felt like a sign of impending breakdown. But the bus kept moving forward. Tommy had taken over monitoring the radio, listening for updates about road conditions and refugee center locations in Milwaukee. What he heard was both encouraging and concerning. The Fairgrounds Refugee Center is at capacity, he reported, but they're still accepting people at Washington High School and at the Community Center on the south side. What about the hospital where Mrs. Chen was going? Frodtert Hospital is operating on emergency protocols. They're taking critical patients, but they're asking people to go to other facilities unless it's life-threatening. We also learned that Milwaukee was under a voluntary evacuation order. The city was recommending that residents who had family or resources elsewhere should consider leaving until the crisis passed. So we're driving into a city that people are trying to leave, Mr. Williams observed. But it's where Maya is, I replied. And it's where the Patels can connect with transportation to their relatives in St. Louis. 15 miles from the city, we encountered our final checkpoint. This one was different from the National Guard post we'd passed earlier. It was being run by local law enforcement, and they were being much more thorough about checking vehicles and documentation. The officer who approached our bus was polite but firm. Sir, I need to see identification for everyone on the bus, and I need to understand the nature of your trip to Milwaukee. I explained that we were transporting a family to connect with relatives and that I was looking for my daughter at the university. I handed over my driver's license and explained that I was a Chicago Transit Authority employee using my bus to help people during the emergency. The officer studied my license and walked around the bus, noting the CTA markings and the official appearance of the vehicle. Sir, are you operating this bus under official authority? Officer, I'm operating this bus under the authority of necessity. These people needed help, and I had the means to help them. The officer was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with regulations versus common sense. Finally, he handed back my license. Milwaukee's got refugee centers set up, but they're overwhelmed. University of Wisconsin campus is partially evacuated, but they've got emergency services still operating. Get your people to safety and get yourself home. He waved us through without checking anyone else's identification. As we entered Milwaukee, I was struck by how different it looked from Chicago. Where Chicago had felt abandoned and desperate, Milwaukee felt organized and purposeful. Snowplows were working the main streets, emergency vehicles were visible, but not frantic, and there were signs of coordinated disaster response. We found the refugee center at Washington High School without difficulty. It was well marked and efficiently run, with volunteers helping arriving families find shelter and resources. The Patel family's goodbye was emotional but hopeful. Mr. Patel had contacted his brother in St. Louis from the truck stop, and arrangements had been made for them to join a convoy of buses leaving Milwaukee the next morning. Demo, Mrs. Patel said as they gathered their belongings, you saved our lives. We will never forget what you did. Take care of each other, I replied. And when this is all over, come back to Chicago. We'll need good people to help rebuild. David handed me his notebook before getting off the bus. I wrote down everything that happened, he said, so people will remember. With the Patel family safely delivered to the refugee center, our group was down to 3, Tommy, Mr. Williams, and myself. The University of Wisconsin campus was our next destination, where Tommy hoped to find information about his family, and I hoped to find Maya. The university campus was surreal. Most of the buildings were dark, but emergency lights marked paths between the structures that were still occupied. Students and staff moved between buildings in small groups, bundled against the cold and carrying supplies. We found the Emergency Coordination Center in the Student Union building. A harried administrator told us that most students had been evacuated or had left to be with their families, but that there were still several hundred people on campus. Maya Kowalski, I said when asked for my daughter's name. The administrator checked a list of students who had registered with emergency services. She's listed as staying in temporary housing at the dormitory on East Campus. But sir, that building is scheduled for evacuation tomorrow morning. Tommy found similar information about his family. His sister was listed as safe at a high school shelter on the north side, and his parents were both accounted for through the fire department's emergency roster. We made it, Tommy said quietly. We actually made it. But our mission wasn't complete yet. We still had to physically locate Maya and Tommy's family, and we had to figure out what came next. The bus transmission was failing, we were low on fuel, and the storm was still raging outside. We drove across campus to the dormitory where Maya was supposed to be staying. The building was mostly dark, but there were lights on the first floor, and people moving around inside. I parked the bus and went inside, leaving Tommy and Mr. Williams to monitor the radio for any updates about road conditions or evacuation schedules. The dormitory lobby was set up as an emergency shelter, with sleeping bags and air mattresses covering the floor. Maybe 50 people were taking refuge there, mostly students, but also some community members who had lost heat in their apartments. Maya Kowalski, I said to the student volunteer coordinating the shelter. Room 112, she replied, pointing down a hallway. I found Maya in a small room with 3 other students, all of them bundled in sleeping bags and winter clothes. When she saw me in the doorway, her face showed disbelief followed by overwhelming relief. Dad, she said, standing up and running to hug me. How did you get here? How is this possible? I held my daughter and felt 21 days of fear and uncertainty drain out of my body. She was safe. She was alive. She was here in my arms. I promised I'd come get you, I said. I promised. 3 weeks in the Ice Age apocalypse taught me that you can't save everyone, but you damn well better save someone, because in the end, the people you choose to fight for become the family you choose to die for, and if you're lucky, they choose to live for you too. Mrs. Chen was receiving dialysis treatment at Froedtert Hospital. The Patel family was safe and heading to relatives who could care for them. Tommy had located his family and was planning to reunite with them in the morning. Mr. Williams had found a veterans support network that was helping displaced military families. And Maya was in my arms, safe and sound. The bus was still running, though the transmission was making concerning noises. The road north was still open for now. And somewhere out there, Maya and I would figure out what came next in a world that had changed forever. But that's a story for another day. The important thing was that we'd made it through the first 3 weeks, and we'd made it together. Hope, like fuel, is something you can't afford to waste. But you can't afford to live without it either.